At the turn of the 19th century, the British economy was booming. The second phase of the Industrial Revolution was pushing Britain to economic dominance in Europe. Steam engines roamed the land, machines fueled the pursuit of immense greed amongst wealthy businessmen. To many a man, this felt like living in a golden age. On the other hand, the chasm between the rich and the poor was ever growing. 10% of the population owned 90% of the wealth. Within the heart of cities, millions of desperate, poverty-stricken individuals begged to be given shelter from the harsh and unforgiving class divide. Amidst the alienated middle class of York, it would be a chap named Rowntree who would listen to the cries of those in need. And what he found would completely undermine all prior held beliefs about poverty in the middle class. His 1901 York report stated, "A child must have no pocket money for sweets, marbles or dolls. A father must smoke or chew no tobacco, and the mother must have no money to buy herself or her children any pretty clothes." Seabrook's 1901 report became a major factor in the future welfare reforms of Britain. That was until 1923, when he would shift his focus to a small, family-run chocolate business named Rowntree's. It was in York where Rowntree's was born. What was once merely a Quaker family was soon to be thrust into the competitive confectionery market, and it started with a man named Henry Isaac Rowntree. Henry did indeed have some experience in the industry, but despite this, Henry struggled to keep the business afloat during a period where chocolate was still very much considered to be an absolute luxury. The company was not helped when Henry began to devote less and less time into its development in order to produce and print a local newspaper. Henry had a decision to make: abandon his chocolate business and thrive in the newspaper industry, or risk his money to remedy the failing venture. So what did Henry decide to do? Henry chose to wholly side with neither option. H.I. Rowntree & Co. was the result of a partnership with Henry's brother Joseph. Unfortunately, Rowntree's was not yet saved overnight. In 1873, Rowntree's made a loss of £50,000 in today's money. Clearly, things were still rocky for the brothers. They knew that they needed a saving grace, a product that would solve all of their woes. As luck would have it, Rowntree's would release what is still today one of their most popular and successful sweets in all of Britain. Their saviour in 1881 were the fruit pastilles. Claude Gauget, a French confectioner, was the man who introduced what was then called Rowntree's crystallised gum pastilles to the streets of York. In 1879, he had given Joseph Rowntree a sample of his new invention. Rowntree refused the initial product, stating that it belonged only to the murky waters of the River Ouse. But Gauget continued to toil and perfect the sweet treat. He knew the potential of his product. Eventually, a winning recipe was found. Sales quadrupled. Rowntree spied their opportunity to expand and jumped at the chance. A Van Hoyten press was purchased. Finally, cocoa butter could be removed from Rowntree's products, leaving them with smooth, sweet chocolate. Having said this, Rowntree's was not alone in the confectionery space. The dominance of market leader Fry's was what Rowntree's aimed to recreate. However, they were not alone in this objective. In fact, a company propelled to fame essentially by Rowntree's themselves would turn out to be their greatest rival. A company founded in 1824 by a fellow Quaker, a company which was granted their first royal warrant in 1854, a company which was run by two brothers in partnership, a company called Cadbury. Cadbury was the brainchild of Quaker John Cadbury. Birmingham, his location; beverages, his poison. John went on to partner with his brother Benjamin in 1847, rebranding the company as the Cadbury Brothers before it was succeeded by his sons George and Richard in 1861. At this time, business was in rapid decline and they were looking bleak. They had to make a vital decision that would change the course of the company forever. George and Richard had to make perhaps one of the most important decisions in the history of the confectionery market. Cadbury would stop producing tea and coffee, and they would begin to produce chocolate. Exports began immediately, and soon Cadbury had manufactured the first modern chocolate Easter egg in 1875. The business had leaped up from its slump, and by 1878 George and Richard relocated to the countryside around Birmingham for higher efficiency. George's next chosen venture was to build Cadbury's very own model village. In 1893 George purchased 120 acres of land to build on, and by 1900 it had expanded to over 300 acres. Coincidentally, a similar model village would be built by Joseph Rowntree just a few years later in 1904. Or perhaps this was less of a coincidence than it might first appear. At this time, Sir Born Rowntree realised the true extent of the squalid conditions of those living in poverty, writing it up in his 1901 York Report. As soon as he told his brother Joseph Rowntree, in the good nature of their religion, they began to build a model village in order to combat these ills. It was a village on the outskirts of York, fitted with 175 houses by 1915. It purposefully kept rent low and served as a stark contrast to the overcrowded conditions of many of the working class. Joseph Rowntree, when asked about the project, said, "I do not wish to establish communities bearing the stamp of charity, but rather of rightly ordered and self-governing communities." He would name this area New Earswick and invited anyone who could work with their hands or their minds. Similar to their awareness of the living conditions, Rowntree's was becoming increasingly conscious of their growing competition, and their concerns were only elevated when in 1905 Cadbury rolled out what would become its flagship product, dairy milk. Cadbury's milk chocolate campaign had been running since 1897. George Cadbury wanted to create a product that had more milk than anything on the market. A recipe was soon conjured up. Dairy milk eventually released in June 1905, and it was quick to experience rapid success. By 1914, it was Cadbury's best-selling product. At the same time that dairy milk was taking over markets, the culmination of the biggest industrial and economic boom in history was bubbling up throughout society. Heavy machinery had consolidated its place in factories. The railways were no longer an extravagant method of travel and transportation. No longer did every employer rely solely on the power of man in order to turn a profit. But with this came unrest from the people. Anger that had been suppressed for a relatively long time began to surface itself amongst workers who had been exploited by vile working conditions and poor wages. Protests followed. Strikes threatened the very basis of the British economy. Violent demonstrations shocked those in power. How could people living in the richest economy in the world be unhappy?
My name's Stewart Taylor and I'm a history teacher at the Fallibroome Academy. I would say there's a variety of factors that feed into this. Firstly, the trade union movement was becoming stronger in the early 1900s. So we know that membership of trade unions almost doubled between 1910 and 1914. You've also got the amalgamation of trade unions to form, for example, the Triple Alliance of railway workers, miners and dockers. And that, therefore, adds to the strength of the trade union movement. But at the same time, from the workers' point of view, it was a time of high inflation and the value of their wages decreased as inflation rose. So they've got economic reasons as well for being dissatisfied. And not all of them were happy with the Liberals and the way that they had tried to help working people. Obviously there were liberal welfare reforms, but the Liberals also had delayed in reversing the Osborne judgment, and they seemed to be slow in protecting trade union rights.
Thanks to trade unions, staple industries, especially now, had leverage over the government and employers. People wanted change. Rowntrees themselves were no strangers to strikes. On 2 occasions, an agreement was negotiated between Rowntrees and their employees by none other than Seaborne Rowntree. This, coupled with labour system changes within the company itself as a result of Seaborne Rowntree's York report, such as early implementation of the 8-hour working day, pension schemes and wage increases, helped to keep the British workers happy. It's no wonder that he has been hailed as the British management movement's greatest pioneer.
I would say that Rowntree's report was extremely important. Not only did it follow on Charles Booth's report into the East End of London from 1899, so it confirms the findings of that, but it was highly statistical. It was based on hard facts, so it couldn't be denied by politicians, and it proved that reasons for poverty were not to do with the selfishness or the laziness of the individual or their immorality, but in fact they were due to economic forces. And I think that very importantly, Seaborne Rowntree was friends with some of the new Liberal politicians, such as David Lloyd George, who would go on to implement the Liberal welfare reforms. So I would say his report had a very large impact, and again it was confirmed by the statistics revealed by the Boer War that up to 40% of potential recruits in some cities for the war were too unhealthy to take part.
Luckily, strikes at Rowntree's were rare. Their early implementation of the 8-hour working day and pension schemes helped to keep workers happy. Stability was what Rowntrees could expect from their employees, a luxury at the time. But these success stories did not help them in their battle with Cadbury. After Dairy Milk's release, Rowntree had to decide whether to follow in the footsteps of the milk chocolate market that was ever expanding in Switzerland. Rowntrees could see the success of the Swiss. From 1890 to 1906, confectionery exports from the milk chocolate dominated nation had experienced a 1600% increase. Surely this seemed a clear-cut decision by Rowntrees. Unfortunately for them, they decided to go against this milk chocolate, calling it merely a fad, therefore failing to capitalise on what would send Cadbury to the top of UK markets. It was this judgment that would turn the fair playing fields unfair. By 1936, dairy milk would take up over half of the chocolate market in the UK. Clearly, something had to be done by Rowntrees, and fast, if they wanted to continue competing seriously with their ever-growing rival. Until this point, Rowntrees had spent virtually nothing on advertising. Joseph Rowntree had believed that merely having a quality product would be enough to drive sales. Whilst this was true, it did not generate sufficient sales to expand competitively as a business. On the other hand, Cadbury had been advertising and promoting their chocolatey treats since as far back as the 1880s. However, Rowntrees could simply sit and watch dairy milk products rise in popularity, as soon the bloodiest 4 years in European history, a period that utilised the culmination of all previous military technological advancements, a time where economies went to die and the working people went to win, a time where unity prevailed amongst the British public, pushed both confectioners to put their chocolate war aside and be key agents in the framework of the Great War. The Great War saw a darkness descend over Britain. The economy plummeted, the alarm set in. The populace had to find unity in order to survive. It didn't matter who you were or what you did as long as you took part in the war effort, and the chocolate businesses were not excluded. Rowntree and Cadbury both offered their premises to aid the war effort, and both had employees go fight on the front lines. Women, known as the Cadbury Angels, now worked in the converted factories building to produce chocolate for the troops. Seaborne Rowntree was eventually advised by soon-to-be Prime Minister David Lloyd George to become the director of the Welfare Department at the Ministry of Munitions in 1915. At a more local level, enlisted ex-employees would receive gifts such as chocolate boxes from the respective businesses. This was in order to improve morale during a time of very harsh rationing. One ex-employee wrote, "I am writing these lines to inform you of the good that one of your tins of cocoa did for me. I was advancing across a wide open field under very heavy fire when a bullet entered my pack. The man next to me shouted, 'Sergeant, are you hit?' Imagine my surprise when I look into the ration bag to see the tin of Rowntrees penetrated on one side but not the other. The bullet had lodged itself into the cocoa, thereby saving my life." Every Rowntree soldier who has ever fallen during warfare is remembered on a plaque installed by Joseph Rowntree in Rowntree Park. All in all, 179 Rowntree employees lost their lives during the war. After 4 long years of miserable combat in vile trench conditions, the war was over. Despite winning, Britain's economy was tarnished. The post-war period was one of economic stagnation. In politics, the Liberal Party collapsed. The Labour Party looked to be the newest rival to the Conservatives. Both parties would exchange leadership of the country throughout this time. Unification of the public from the war had brought about major societal change. Some suggested that this was the turning point toward a more egalitarian society. The coming years would prove to be one of those of high unemployment and low income. For a market that was still considered to be a luxury, this did not look good for the chocolate manufacturers. However, sales boomed in the years immediately following the war. With the removal of rationing and a celebratory attitude lingering in the air, the Roaring Twenties set the expectation of eternal economic growth. Sales in tons in the market would gradually improve during this time of statistical economic hardship.
I would say that both world wars, to some extent, brought about the feeling that Britain should be a better place once they were over. And I think if we take the First World War as the first example, that's reflected in Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister when the war ended in November 1918. In his election campaign, he stressed the idea of homes fit for heroes, building good quality council housing for the returning soldiers, although that promise wasn't entirely met, because Lloyd George's hands were tied by his being in a coalition government. After the First World War at the same time, though, there was a short-lived post-war boom, but then a recession and a rise in unemployment, which kind of counters those kind of demands and desires.
At the same time costs were increasing, revenue from the chocolate market actually ended up decreasing from 1920 onwards. Just as recovery appeared possible towards the back end of the decade, just as businesses began to grow confidence in their own futures, this hope was thwarted, initially by factors outside of the confectionery market. October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. Hundreds of stockbrokers watched in panic and disbelief as the market began to plummet. Millions of dollars were being lost every hour in the US stock market. By October 29th, billions had been lost. The US was about to enter an economic crisis not yet faced by any nation in the world. Unemployment, high. Spirits, low. And the UK was also heavily affected. Both Rowntree and Cadbury experienced a fall in operating profit during the Great Depression. Rowntree was experiencing severe financial troubles. They knew they needed to evolve their own strategies in order to stay afloat. But where were they going wrong? Previous to 1930, Rowntrees had spent virtually nothing on advertising. Their only notable achievement in this regard was producing one of the earliest adverts to feature accompanying sound.
And York Milk by Rowntree & Co. Limited of York, Yorks.
After being hit by the initial wave of the Great Depression, Rowntree decided to appoint a new marketing manager for their chocolate division by the name of George Harris. Under his leadership, advertising became a staple point of Rowntree. He oversaw the introduction of the Kit Kat and Aero in 1935, both of which are household names today. Yet despite the radical changes made to the company, there was no immediate improvement in revenue or profits. The Great Depression continued to wreak havoc on economies all around the world. Rowntree's is still trailed behind Cadbury significantly. By 1936, Cadbury was looking towards another upward trend in operating profits. Rowntree's forecast, on the other hand, looked about as level as it can get. As the economy appeared to be recovering once more, an event that seemed all too familiar loomed ominously on the horizon. Only 21 years after the Great War, a tragedy which the world had promised to never repeat, World War II forced the mobilisation of troops across Europe and beyond. This was the war that would, on paper, push Britain into absolute and total economic devastation. Over 30,000 tons of explosives were unleashed upon the public of Britain, and all in all, roughly 450,000 Britons died in World War I and II. By the time the war was won, the country was in ruin. Houses, businesses, families, all destroyed. GDP dropped 13% from 1944 to 47. However, this painted quite the opposite picture of a post-war Britain.
After the Second World War, it's more significant. Labour come to power with a landslide majority in 1945. There's a demand for change. The Beveridge Report was very popular, and obviously Labour went on to implement extensive welfare reform, building on the reform of the Liberals earlier on, and set up the National Health Service. So the kind of change that happened after the Second World War was more significant and extensive, I would say, than that came about after the First World War.
The newly emerging American market strengthened confidence in the future of business, and it would be Rowntree's who would take advantage of this emerging sector when, in 1969, they would form a coalition with perhaps the biggest chocolate manufacturer in the US. Hershey's would begin to sell Rowntree's products. Chocolate was no longer considered a luxury commodity. Instead, it was becoming a tasty treat available for anyone with spare change to purchase.
First of all, they might have been more inclined to spend on those products because of the fact that this was a period of austerity after the Second World War, and there was so much rationing and life was very bleak in many ways that people might have looked to these little luxuries, to improve their lives, as it were. But on the other hand, those products were rationed during the Second World War, and in fact until the late 1940s in the case of chocolates and the early 1950s in the case of sweets. So therefore it was difficult for people to purchase them easily anyway at that time, I would say.
1969 was a year not only known for the hippie movement, promoting values of peace and love, it was also a year of unparalleled significance for Rowntree's and Cadbury. General Foods offered to purchase Rowntree for $37 million. They declined. The aforementioned deal with Hershey's was negotiated, and both Rowntree and Cadbury would take a step into the unknown, marking their largest external expansion until this date. Whether it be coincidence or competition, in both cases mergers were the chosen advancement. Rowntree's with Macintosh, Cadbury with Schweppes. Rowntree's would have been joyous to have Macintosh's established and successful products associated with theirs. Rolos, Munchies, and Quality Street were all made in association with Rowntree's products. Cadbury took a slightly different route. Schweppes were considered pioneers of the soft drink industry. Differentiation was their strength. This fork in the road between the two titans of UK confectionery displayed both unification and contrast. The line between family values and corporate growth was becoming blurred. On one hand, Rowntree's could sell more of their family-made product, whilst helping a fellow family business along the way. On the other hand, two family companies had come together in the pursuit of profit and expansion. Had ethics gone out of the window for the companies? Of course not. Both brands continued to act as they had previously. Naturally, they needed to aim for the high revenue in order to remain alive and competitive, but the essence of their business was still to provide the service of good chocolate to the British market. Life went on. More and more employees joined the forces of either side. Factories opened, production progressed to become more efficient. For 19 years, the trend of Cadbury outperforming Rowntree continued, until, suddenly, there was a break in the monotony. From this point, Rowntrees would never be the same again. The early morning of the 13th of April, 1988, the beginning of an aggressive invasion. Brisk advances and decisive measures were put into place. This was not a real war, of course. Instead, it was the attempted takeover of Rowntree by Swiss confectioner Jacob Suchard. The first move. By 9 AM, 15% of shares had successfully been sold to the firm. The opposition, fellow Swiss firm Nestlé, who had already tried to buy Rowntrees previously, would be the ones to block the Jacob Suchard buyout. They couldn't afford to let one of the largest UK confectioners fall into the vicarious hands of their competitors. The counterattack. Moving swiftly, they renegotiated with the Rowntree's board of directors, who eventually agreed to a Nestlé takeover. 2.5 billion. This was what Nestlé had valued Rowntrees at. What was once a small family company in York had grown to be a multi-billion-dollar business. But was this expansion worth the cost? Were the battle's losses too great to warrant the advance? Time would quickly reveal the answer. Going forwards, Nestlé would ensure that the Rowntree name was erased from many of their original products, all but the fruit pastel, the fruit gum, and the Rowntree cocoa lost Rowntree branding. Macintosh products faced a similar fate, and their brand was essentially killed because of it, a fate that Rowntrees could have easily shared. Many of the best-selling products in the confectionery market today were Rowntrees to begin with. Aero, Kit Kat, Smarties, Polos, After Eights. All of these had their origins stripped from them and thrown aside as if they had no importance whatsoever. It was clear now that Rowntrees had fallen deep into the jaws of one of the corporate giants of the world. Nestlé's replacement of branding on Rowntree's products displayed their intentions. They didn't care about family values or morals. They wanted profits. The acquisition of Rowntree marked the point at which they had truly succumbed to capitalism in its truest form. As a result, the good family name of Rowntree was soon to be tarnished, dragged through the mud. The Nestlé acquisition saw the association of Rowntree with Nestlé, a company synonymous with chocolate and beverages, but above all else, controversies. The 1970s was a decade of war in Asia, Watergate,
I have never been a quitter,
and the oil crisis. Amidst this chaos, Nestlé was making sure that they would cement themselves in the history books. However, not for the reason that they would have hoped for. A faceless claim made by Nestlé encouraged mothers to use their baby formula, stating that it was healthier than breastfeeding. Boycotts followed, and Nestlé agreed to follow marketing code in 1984. However, they would go on to repeat these acts in various countries on at least 3 different occasions. Nestlé appeared to be addicted to the negative publicity, intentionally raising prices in the Canadian market, demanding debt repayments from a country in famine, forced labour in Thailand, severe deforestation, anti-union activities in Colombia leading to the murder of their own employees. Even slavery and child labour has been utilised by Nestlé in their chase for market growth. Nestlé themselves stated in 2019 that they could not guarantee that their products were free from child labour. Rowntrees was now lumped into the same boat, was sharing the same cell as Nestlé. Nestlé knew that in spite of their frequent brushes with the law and ethics, their products would remain in high demand. Throughout the 1990s, they continued to grow rapidly. But as a result of their lead, Cadbury was able to maintain their position in the market. Rowntree still felt as if they had been defeated by Cadbury in every way, constantly outperformed, outsold, and outmaneuvered. Like Rowntree's, Cadbury would eventually lose the privilege of self-management in 2010 after they were taken over by the American Kraft Foods. $11.5 billion was the valuation of Cadbury. The takeover was met with negative reception from the public of the UK. One of the country's biggest international legacies had been annexed by the Americans. Then Prime Minister Gordon Brown's standing was equally negative, and the Royal Bank of Scotland received backlash after supporting the takeover.
I think that there's a couple of aspects to this. I mean, first, Brown was quite concerned that the American company Kraft wouldn't invest as much money in Cadbury's as had been done previously, and he was very concerned about the way that Kraft might treat the workers that were still at Cadbury's, who were now under new management, as it were. But also, politically speaking, I think that Cadbury's was very much a British firm. It's something that had existed since the middle of the 19th century, and its transfer of control out of the country might have been seen as unpatriotic or something that was damaging Britain's status, I would say. So he's trying to say that he wants to keep, or he would like to have kept, Cadbury's under British control, and he's concerned that American companies won't treat the workforce as well as they had, as Cadbury's had, should I say, previously.
Kraft Foods would split in 2012, separating its snack food lines from its grocery brands. Mondelez International now owned Cadbury. At first, this new managerial structure looked hopeful. Cadbury were allowed to retain their original branding on products very different from Nestlé's treatment of Rowntree's, but inevitably, it wouldn't take long for the same corporate corruption that had plagued Rowntree's to become equally apparent in the lifeblood of Cadbury. Gradually, Mondelez International's poison began to spread throughout the company. Factories across the country were closed at the expense of thousands of jobs in order to pursue foreign production.
Cadbury's manufacturing plant in Bristol will be closed down by 2011, despite hopes for a reprieve for the 400 employees working there.
This trend extended internationally, and Cadbury began to close factories in Ireland, Canada, the US, and New Zealand in order to move production to advantaged locations such as China, India, Brazil, and Mexico. Of course, this choice was made to cut costs by underpaying and mistreating foreign workers, something that could not be done in the countries in which they used to be based. Under Kraft Foods, they were fed the instructions uttered to every financial kingpin. The Quaker values of yesteryear had all but been forgotten. Cadbury was now being run for one thing and one thing only, the very basis on which modern society was built upon: money.
The successes of capitalism are that it encourages individual initiative and entrepreneurialism. So obviously there is a reward for those businessmen, if you like, that have done well under the capitalist system, and it encourages companies to be efficient, and obviously they seek profit and so on. So there is a reward, a tangible reward for those who benefit from the capitalist system. But I would say it's also a very flawed system because it does involve exploitation of a huge number of people, working people. It involves sometimes paying them low wages. It creates inequalities within society, quite large inequalities. And it can create social attitudes such as blaming those who are out of work or poor for their circumstances. So on the whole, I think it's a flawed system, although obviously socialist systems have been tried in other countries and they haven't always worked either.
Flashback to 2008. An ordinary morning in the Cadbury offices, as higher-ups all strolled to their desks for another day of monotonous management, a message from the Food Standards Agency arrived. They had called for all artificial colours to be removed from the Cadbury products. Cadbury had pledged to remove them all in the near future. Their link to hyperactivity could be damaging to the minds of their own consumers. The FSA was satisfied that appropriate action would be taken. After all, they were the largest confectioner in Britain. They had the resources to make changes. But it would cost them a significant amount of money. So, of course, in 2009, Cadbury was still using artificial colours in the majority of their products. They were now in breach of the instruction given to them a year prior. You may be wondering where Rowntree's was in this debacle. Surely they would be affected by the ruling as much as Cadbury. Well, of course they were. They too had traded products containing artificial colours, but they didn't even have to lift a finger because Rowntree had already removed all artificial colours in 2006, 2 years before they even had to. This small action proved that there remained a drive to keep consumers happy at the expense of profits at Rowntree's, a small nod to the family values the business was built upon. At the same time this fiasco was unfolding, Cadbury was entwined in a toxic web of controversy that more than held a candle to Nestlé's questionable practices. Where the companies had once competed for success, they now competed over negative public reception. Prior to the 2010 Kraft takeover, Cadbury were no strangers to upsetting their consumers. In 2006, traces of salmonella were discovered in their products, but fearing a loss of profits from the approaching Easter season, they knowingly put the products on the nation's shelves anyway, and even delayed this information from reaching food standards agencies for 6 whole months. It took 37 people being poisoned from the stone-hearted executive to finally give in to criticism and recall the products. A similar event occurred in 2008, the same year that Schweppes de-merged, when melamine, a chemical used in pesticides, was found in Cadbury products from 3 different Chinese factories. The company had now made it clear how little regard they held for the public's criticism. Following the Kraft takeover, the controversies increased in number and began to demonstrate the money-centric attitude of new Cadbury. 2014, traces of pork were found in certain Cadbury products in Malaysia. 2015, a Cadbury employee severely injured a couple whilst racing another car through Birmingham at over 120 miles an hour. 2018, worker Mikhail Ram was killed after operating a moulding machine with an understaffed team, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. Prior to his death, Mikhail had requested staffing support, but of course his request was denied. Even just this year, in 2022, it was revealed that children as young as 10 were harvesting cocoa beans in Ghana for Mondelez International whilst working in dangerous conditions with no supervisions or protective clothing and being paid less than £2 per hour. Even the family recipe was tampered with, albeit not because of Kraft. In 2009, traditional cocoa butter in many of their products was replaced with palm oil. This was only a year before the Kraft takeover, and so this explains why many people online attributed the change in quality and the taste to the American company. Despite this false alarm, the use of palm oil attracted a lot of negative publicity towards Cadbury, with many experts pointing out the rampant levels of deforestation caused by the harvest of this scarce resource. In addition, newer Cadbury products boast a lower volume of sugar compared to previous. Cadbury lovers were distraught once these changes were introduced. An anonymous social media user angrily exclaimed, "Message to Cadbury's, if it ain't broke, don't fix it." The point? Kraft Foods and later Mondelez International have now almost entirely stripped from this business that was once the pride of Birmingham, of the entire nation, almost every trace of the family values that they were built upon to begin with. Outside of the company, however, now that is a different matter. Despite the bitter rivalry between Rowntree's and Cadbury's, both companies were simply an extension of the people behind them. John Cadbury and Joseph Rowntree were perhaps more similar than each man would have liked to admit. Despite their feuds, they could both consolidate over one thing: charity. Their surviving legacies exist today in the form of their humanitarian efforts and the charities they founded. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Cadbury Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, the Barrow Cadbury Trust, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust. All of these organisations were sprouted from Cadbury and Rowntree families and are still active today, with many members being direct descendants from the respective families. not to mention the welfare efforts of specific individuals among the families throughout history, such as Benjamin Sebum Rowntree's contributions to public health improvements with his 1901 York Report, or James Cadbury's modern-day efforts to create a sustainable chocolate brand of his own named Love Cocoa, donating 10% of all profits to charity and planting a tree for every product sold.
James Cadbury in particular has taken great pride in honouring his great-grandfather John Cadbury's legacy, building his own company around what the old Cadbury company was like before the buyout. Clearly, both companies are very much still present and active today, working to continue their legacies despite both having their companies ripped away from them, being a force to watch as cold corporate conglomerates work to bury their origins. Today, Cadbury's is still owned by Mondelez International and Rowntree's is still under the wing of Nestle, and combined both companies bring in around 120 billion per year. Cadbury remains one of the most popular chocolate brands in the world, and in 2016, Mondelez International made almost double Nestle's revenue. Statistically, Cadbury is still on top.
Rowntree's is no longer a name associated with Aero, Kit Kat or Polo, but only with fruit pastels, fruit gums and randoms. It is the undeniable truth that Rowntree's does not receive the recognition it deserves.
Looking at the charred remains of these two companies begs the question, what is the true cost of corporate greed? Yes, profits are at an all-time high. Yes, these two companies are international titans. Yes, the faceless executives can pay whatever they want on a car or a mansion. But what has been lost along the way? Ethics, care for the consumers, the origins of these companies that were lovingly crafted not for the sake of profit margins, but to make people happy. Sadly, this upsetting trend is in no way limited to these unfortunate chocolate companies. In fact, it is almost a definite stage of any modern business. Controversy and corruption can be found in almost any corporation, if only you would take the effort to look for it.
Heinz, Ben & Jerry's, Oculus. Sometimes there isn't any need to uncover the corruption at all. It's often immediately apparent that a corporation has lost all of its heart and soul. Take Disney, a company that was built on the dreams of one man who loved animation and wanted to share his love with the masses, now stretches a barren wasteland of live-action remakes and murdered creativity, far from Walt's original vision.
We enhanced the Disney brand by spying on you. We own you. You live in our neighborhoods and you are literally our property.
By prioritizing profit over ethics, these companies have strayed far away from their long-dead ethoses and have seemingly forgotten the concept of providing quality products to the public with all their heart.
It is certainly a unique perspective that we look at the journeys of these two companies, their creation, their rise to success, their rivalry, their downfall that was so decisively intertwined with the state of modern corporate culture. One that offers insight into the damage this model can cause not only to the success of businesses, but to the consumers, to the heart-filled legacies that are buried and forgotten along the way. What can be done to save the work of these ever-vanishing visionaries? Will things improve in the coming years, or have we reached a precipice of which there is no return? What can we do to mend a broken system when our society already remains so fractured? Of course, it is impossible to answer these questions, but it is our role as a society to come together and try and solve them. But in the meantime, all we can do is hope that the family names of Cadbury and Rowntree will live on, not only as chocolate companies, but as groups of people who did their bit to change the future of the world.